time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, Denise Ohio. Denise Ohio is a Washington-based writer, producer, director, and filmmaker. She is the author of several books, including The Finer Grain, End of Empire, a novel, The Five Essential Steps in Digital Video. Her films include Amazing World, Family Business, and her latest film, which she is here to talk about, Verona, the story of the Everett Massacre, which premiered this last week in Everett on the 100th anniversary of that massacre. Ohio, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So to start out, tell us, what was your motivation in producing your film Verona, the story of the Everett Massacre?
Several years ago, about 15 or 16 years ago, I was asked to a meeting with people who wanted to create a fiction feature about this particular historical event. And I realized in the middle of that meeting, not even the middle, about 5 minutes in, that this movie was never going to get made. But I saw a guy sitting at the opposite end of this table, and we locked eyes, and I realized this was a local historian who had some things to say. And he began to tell this story, and as I said, I realized this movie was never going to get made, but I wanted to hear more about what had happened on that day, November 5th, 1916. And I realized I wanted to know more because I wanted to know, how did people get to this point where shooting at each other was somehow the solution to a whole series of problems? I wanted to know why they made the decisions they made, who they were, and what happened to them before and after this event. And an obsession was born. So I followed that, and I'm still following that story up until today. Well,
I was fortunate to be able to actually watch your film yesterday. It is clearly a labor of love. It's a wonderful film that I'm thinking would be great to integrate into our school systems, if nothing else. So maybe prior to talking about the events of Sunday, November 5th, 1916, you could set us up with a bit of how Everett came to be and more.
Sure. I spend an hour and a half in this documentary discussing those very issues, and I start with the founding of Everett, which was in 1892. And basically, as my friend Dave Dilgard, a local historian, has said, Everett was a speculative development on an uninhabited peninsula. Essentially, the railroad wanted to come in and terminate somewhere in Puget Sound, and a bunch of guys back east, colluding with a fellow named Henry Hewitt from Tacoma, thought maybe they could convince James J. Hill of the Great Northern Railroad to terminate his railroad at this place that didn't even exist. And this is, we're all familiar with the dot-com bubble. This was essentially the equivalent, but out there where Everett now is. It's purely speculation, and people thought that they were going to be able to buy pieces of land and turn around and sell them, and they would get very rich. And Norm Clark, also another historian, described them as screaming hysterical people, that they thought they were going to get rich overnight. So Everett started in a fever of gambling. Interestingly enough, after a series of economic disasters that affected the entire country. We've got the Silver Panic of 1896. We've got another Wall Street panic in 1907. By the turn of the century, Everett had become an established city, and the people had come out to live and work in this place because there were jobs. And a lot of those jobs were in the shingle mills. Western red cedar shingles were a great product to put on your roof. You want to build a house, you better put a roof on it. They're still a great product for roofs. So people went to work in the shingle mills. And if you went to work in the shingle mills, particularly if you were a shingle sawyer, you better have a lot of courage. Stand-up shingle saws have two blades on them that are 3 feet across. They spin very fast, and if you trip, if you fall, you will lose a hand or an arm or your life. They're very dangerous. They work. They create a great product, but it takes very courageous people to operate those saws. I happen to know that because my friend, Bill Marcantel, up past Ozo, outside Darrington, is a shingle sawyer. And I went up there and I talked to him and shot footage of him at his upright shingle saw, which was made in 1908 and sits in a trailer outside of where he lives. It's sitting on a trailer. And it was amazing. They're terrifying. Of course, Bill, being the guy he is, asked me if I wanted to cut some shingles. And normally I like that kind of thing. And I could not do it. The saws are too terrifying. This gives you an idea of the kind of people who formed the Shingle Weavers Union, which started the first one started in about 1902 or 1903. A Shingle Weavers Union was for everybody who worked in a shingle mill. That was everything from the guy who shoveled wood into the incinerator to keep the boilers going, to the people who packed the shingles, to the shingle sawyers, to everybody in a shingle mill. And this was a very militant, these were very militant unions. You could find them all over the Pacific Northwest. And in Everett particularly, these unions were very powerful and very, very militant because Everett was the world capital of Western red cedar shingles. So we get up to 1914. 1914, in the spring, the Shingle Weavers Union went on strike. And it immediately, World War I had started in August. It was 1915 in May. And when the Shingle Weavers Union went on strike, they couldn't have really picked a worse time. There was an economic recession going on and wartime inflation. And the strike immediately turned violent. And so there was fist fights and clubbings and the usual things that happened with these kinds of conflicts between unions and management. And the Shingle Weavers Union called off their strike when they came to an agreement with the mill owners that when shingle prices went up, so would wages. Now, to me, this strikes me as perfectly reasonable. And I think pretty much anybody else would think this was pretty reasonable. And by 1916, the United States was seeing an economic boom because of World War I, and the prices of shingles started to go up. And all over the Pacific Northwest, the wages of the people in the shingle mills started to go up, except in Everett. So the shingle weavers went on strike again on May 1st because they said to the mill owners, we had a deal. And again, seems very reasonable to me. The shingle mill owners, however, just said basically, well, yeah, no. They decided they weren't going to live up to that handshake bargain. Again, the strike rapidly became violent. There was pushing and shoving and clubbing. And at one point, a mill owner brought out his strike breakers and beat the living hell out of a bunch of shingle weavers who were walking a picket line. And the city police stood and watched while this happened. When the shingle weavers decided to get their own back, along with just people in the town, the police suddenly became involved. A shot was fired. One of the strikers was shot in the leg. And then the shingle weavers knew that the forces of law enforcement were against them. So this is the setup, just basically for the environment. This is July when this is all happening. And we still have 4 months to go before we actually get to the shootout on the Everett City Dock, which involves a different set of people.
So talk a little bit about one of the people featured prominently in your film, Sheriff Don McRae.
Well, Don McRae is an interesting guy. And one of the reasons I focus on the Shingle Weavers Union is that Don McRae, in 1908, he had been very active in the Shingle Weavers Union around Marysville, which is where he lived. And in 1908, he had become president of that union. He had become their international secretary. He was very active. He considered himself a very proud trade union shingle weaver. And it became pretty clear he had ambitions beyond just working in the mills and being a member of a union. And in 1912, he ran for office as the sheriff of Snohomish County as a progressive Republican. And with the help of labor, was elected. He immediately began remodeling the county jail. His reputation for physical courage, his reputation for treating people decently was widely known. He was highly respected. And when he ran for re-election in 1914, not only was he re-elected with the help of labor again, but as they said, he was considered the best sheriff in Snohomish County history when he was running for re-election. So Don McRae was a union man, and proudly so. And when the shingle weavers went on strike in 1916, he presented them with a check for $25 for their strike fund. That's just a bit less than $1,000 in today's money. That was real money because he wanted to help. So that's sort of where we are with Don McRae, a man who normally you would think of was rather admirable as a law enforcement officer.
And a group that is prominent in the film is the IWW, the Wobblies. Can you talk about their creation and how they fit in the story?
Sure. You will hear people say that the IWW came to Everett in support of the Shingle Weavers Union. And while individual members of the IWW certainly did, the IWW as an organization did not. The Wobblies were founded in 1905, partially as a response to the American Federation of Labor, which was a trade union organization, and the Shingle Weavers had affiliated with the AFL. Trade unions were a little different than an industrial union, which is the IWW preached industrial unionism. A trade union basically represented everybody with the same trade. So in a shingle mill, for example, all the shingle sawyers would belong to a shingle sawyers union. The shingle packers, who were actually the shingle weavers, that was their nickname, all of the packers would have all belonged to a shingle packers union. As we know, the Shingle Weavers Union didn't work that way. They were a little more towards this industrial union idea, that everybody who worked in that industry was represented by one union. So if a shingle mill, if the workers decided to go on strike, everybody in that mill would walk out, not just the shingle sawyers or the shingle packers, etc. And the IWW had a series of splits and internal dissension and things like this. But they also did some things publicly, which is just remarkable, considering that not only were they an industrial union, and they were a revolutionary union, they represented not just skilled laborers, people who were carpenters or shingle sawyers, people who were highly skilled and highly trained. They wanted to represent everybody. And that meant people who sweep up, people who do the hardest, dirtiest work for the least wages, the people who have the least power. And the IWW was just outspoken in their support because they said the work still has to be done. And these are workers, so we'll represent everyone. And that an injury to one was an injury to all, and that we should all join the one big union. So the industrial workers of the world and the AFL did not see eye to eye. And the IWW was not going to support AFL policy, certainly, or AFL unions, though individual members certainly would and did. And in Everett, we had dual union people who they carried an IWW card and they carried a Shingle Weavers Union card up on the picket lines to support the Shingle Weavers strike. So in about July, when there was all of this other ruckus going on between the Shingle Weavers, law enforcement, mill owners, strike breakers, Pinkerton guards, the usual groups of people, a man by the name of James Rowan arrived in Everett. And Second Jesus Jimmy, which was his nickname, which I love, had been sent on a speaking tour by the General Executive Board in Chicago. Basically, they said, we want you to go to all these places, speak on street corners, try to get new members, and we'll pay you, and when you come back, we'll give you some money. And this was his job. Second Jesus Jimmy was sent out on his speaking tour, and he went up to Everett. He had no idea there was a strike going on. When he stood on the corner of Hewitt and Wentmore, which was the traditional free-speaking corner in Everett to talk about the one big union. And Second Jesus Jimmy was he was told by Don McRae, look, we have some stuff going on in town here. We got the strike going on. Maybe if you could go and come back after the strike is over, you can say whatever you want for as long as you want. Nobody's going to care. Well, Second Jesus Jimmy wasn't called Second Jesus Jimmy because he was a mild-mannered fella. So James Rowan saw an opportunity, reported back to the IWW. The IWW saw a potential victory if they were able to go into Everett to convince the Shingle Weavers, one of the most militant unions in the region, to leave the AFL and join them. So again, we've got a lot of setup here. So by the one thing to remember about this is that the IWW had, in the recent past, fought a series of what was called free speech fights. They had started in about 1909 or 1910. Basically, in fact, in Spokane, the IWW wanted to fight against employment agencies. Now, an employment agency, basically, if you were a worker, you paid the agency a certain amount of money, $1. They would get you a job. They would send you out to that job. And often you'd get out to the job, you'd work for a week, they'd fire you, and you'd have to go back into town, pay the employment agency $1. And it was a scam. And the IWW and the workers said, this is a scam. It's wrong. We shouldn't be paying for these jobs. And the IWW led the charge to let people know that this was going on and it was wrong and we should put a stop to it. So they began speaking on the street corners, for example, in Spokane, I believe in 1910. And the Spokane police arrested them. And the IWW said, I have every right in the world to stand on a street corner and speak my mind, which is absolutely correct. So they made a call for wobblies from all over the country to come stand on the street corner and speak their minds. And somebody would get up on a soapbox, fellow workers, they'd be dragged away and arrested. They would fill the jails and clog the courts. And this, of course, cost these jurisdictions money. And they realized, we can't afford this. So they would often yield to the wishes of the IWW. They had fought these free speech fights in San Diego, in Fresno, Spokane. There was one in Colorado. There were many of these free speech fights from 1910 to about 1912. Got them a lot of publicity and support because I would dare you to find anyone in the United States who would say, oh, no, that's okay for the cops to throw you in jail because they don't like your opinions. I mean, even my 83-year-old mother got angry when she heard about that. We don't do that here. We're not supposed to. It happens. But we do have these principles, and we do have these, these things are supposed to be something that can't be denied us. And the IWW, in fact, proved that even the least of us, those of us with the least money, the least power, the least good grooming, none of that stuff mattered. You have the right to speak your mind. However, and again, you will hear people say that the IWW was all about free speech. The IWW was an industrial union. They were a revolutionary union. They were all about organizing workers. Free speech was a means to an end. And while they got a ton of publicity and support for their free speech fights, rightfully so, they stopped doing them because they were never able to capitalize on those victories, on these free speech fights that they would win, and keep their new members remaining members. So by 1912, they said, we're not going to do the free speech fights anymore because it's a waste of our energy. We really want to organize workers into the one big union and move forward. Except in Everett in 1916, the opportunity the IWW saw for itself was based on a free speech fight. James Rowan was told, get out of town. We don't want to hear what you have to say. Here on the free speech corner at Hewitt and Whitmore, we don't want to hear what you have to say. And a free speech fight would get them attention and support. So the free speech fight was on in Everett by August of 1916.
So somewhere prior to November 5th, there was an event that happened and are called Beverly Park. Can you talk about that?
Oh, my. The early fall was filled with confrontations, arrests, people getting thrown out of town. Often they were just escorted to the interurban tracks and told, get out of town. And they would walk back from Everett to Seattle, 25, 30 miles. Or they were stopped from getting into the county at all because Don McRae, who had been made the police power in town, had to actually patrol the entire county. And in order to do that, he deputized about 400 citizen deputies to assist. Now, that's something a sheriff can do, a police chief can't, which is one of the reasons he was given police power in the city, and the Everett City Police weren't in charge anymore. The citizen deputies were made up of just, again, regular people like me and you. And they were not averse to using the clubs that had been made for them in the lumber mills. They were not averse to punching somebody, or they were not averse to using the power that they'd been given to repress not just free speech, but freedom of association and just the freedom to be left alone. Beverly Park is very upsetting to me in many ways, and probably primarily because this was something they planned. On October 30th, 41 Wobblies were aboard a steamship called the Verona. They were met at the Everett City Dock by about 60 citizen deputies who shoved them into cars and drove them out to Beverly Park. Beverly Park is where Casino Road is in Everett now. It was basically just the middle of nowhere in the middle of this populated area. It still kind of is. It's kind of dark out there in the middle of the night. And they were taken to the interurban tracks, and they were forced to run a gauntlet. So the Wobblies, one at a time, were sent through two lines of citizen deputies who were armed with clubs. It wasn't just citizen deputies. There were some regular deputies there as well. They were forced to run between these two rows of men and were beaten as they ran through these lines. Again, as I say, this was planned. This was a sort of situation where my friend Margaret Riddle says it is surprising no one was killed. And we're talking about the kind of mindset and planning that thinks lynching is somehow an acceptable thing to do. The men sent through the gauntlet some of the stories are really, it's just terrible. And the next morning, when witnesses went out to this site, there were pools of blood, there were broken teeth, there were pieces of clothing that men trying to get away from the beating would have their clothing torn from their bodies as they were trying to get away. And Reverend Oscar McGill, a clergyman in Everett, contacted the IWW office in Seattle and said, we have to do something about this, because even many people in Everett at this point were shocked, stunned, and angry at the police repression that was going on, and they wanted to protest these actions. And Reverend McGill talked to Herbert Mahler of the Seattle IWW and said, why don't you come back up? We can find a tabernacle, a church, where we can all gather, and the community can register its protest and et cetera. And Herbert Mahler said, how about instead we all meet at the corner of Hewitt and Wetmore, the free speech corner? And McGill agreed to this, and they set a date and a time, and they were going to meet at the corner of Hewitt and Wetmore on the afternoon of November 5th. So Beverly Park was really, it's interesting because later there was a trial, and the county prosecutor said Beverly Park had nothing to do with what happened on November 5th. And the IWW in the courtroom laughed.
So, unfortunately, I've only left you like 3 minutes to tease us with a description of what happened November 5th.
Oh, my. About 250 members of the IWW boarded the Verona at Coleman Dock. The rest, about another 40 members of the IWW, then boarded the Callista, a second steamship, and the Verona, which was one of the fastest steamers on Puget Sound, headed towards Everett. It was a beautiful fall day. They arrived at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, where they were met with by Sheriff Don McRae with about 140 citizen deputies. You will hear people say there were hundreds of deputies on the dock. There were 140. It was stipulated in the trial. And of those deputies, about half of them were carrying guns. The men on the Verona were also armed. You will again hear people tell you they weren't. They most certainly were. The Industrial Worker, the IWW paper, identified between 18 and 25 men carrying guns. And IWW, who turned state's evidence, said there were about 29 men carrying guns. Again, and I would say, this doesn't strike me as something unusual. You know, approximately 10% of the people aboard that ship carrying guns, yeah, that would sound about right, maybe even a little low. But because of the romanticism of this event, everybody on the Verona can't be, they've all got to be clean, shaven, handsome, and complete innocent lambs instead of the people that they are. The Verona pulled up. The sheriff stepped out, raised his right hand. Now remember, this is 250 guys on this boat. They're singing on their way up to Everett. And when the sheriff steps out, they're hooting, they're hollering, they're making all kinds of noise. The sheriff raises his right hand and says, I'm Sheriff Don McRae, and I just want to know, who's your leader? And the guys on the boat yell back, we're all leaders. Okay, so Don McRae says, well, I'm just here to tell you, you can't land here. And the response was, the hell we can't. And there was a moment of silence. Don McRae turned back to talk to his deputies. And then there was a shot, possibly two, and a volley of shots. Don McRae, his back to the ship, was hit in his lower left leg. He was, if not the first man shot, one of the first men shot. He spun around, raised his gun, and started firing back. And so did his deputies. At the end of the shooting, we don't know how long it lasted. Estimates were anywhere from 3.5 minutes to 10 minutes. Hundreds of shots were fired. At the end of it, 5 men were dead. Dozens were wounded, and about 6 men who had fallen into the water from the ship had disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to them. When the shots started coming, the men on the ship ran from the port side to the starboard side of the ship. The ship tilted. Men fell onto the deck. They were trapped beneath one another. They couldn't get away. Other men fell into that water. Only one man made it back to the ship. On the dock, of course, the shooting started. The deputies, who did not have their guns out, they were not ambushing. There was not a machine gun, any of that other stuff. They turned and ran for the cover of the warehouses. It was insane and panicked, and there was bloodshed and cursing, and it would have been a nightmare. Imagine being that man on the forward deck of the Verona. You're just trying to get off the ship. You turn and run. You trip over somebody who's already fallen, and somebody falls on top of you, and somebody else falls on top of you, and somebody else falls on top of him, and he's bleeding because he's been hit in the leg or the back or the neck or the head, and he's bleeding on you.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We're talking with Denise Ohio. She's producer and director of the new film Verona, the story of the Everett Massacre. And your film, you did multiple showings last week in Everett, but otherwise, I know it's being submitted to numerous film festivals. Is that going to be the best place for people who would like to see it?
Yeah, we're going the festival route because the film isn't sold yet. So with luck, we'll get into some festivals. Love to get into SIFF, and then we may be able to parlay that into a sale. See if we can get a theatrical release or broadcast.
All right. Well, with that out of time, I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you.